So the UN in Africa, the way we are working to address climate action is by responding to the member state priorities. So in Africa, we know through the member states, through the African Union Commission, that the number one priority is adaptation. And within adaptation, what we are doing to support member states is to create resilience and support early warning with the high rise in incidences of extreme weather events, whether it is droughts or floods. Countries want more support on early warning to avert loss and damage, but also to avert catastrophic loss of lives and livestock and livelihoods for communities. African countries also want us to support on food systems and food security. It is a big issue that impacts millions of Africans. And so we are working to support member states to create integrity in food systems. But climate finance is a big issue also for our member states. How do we bring in more resources to support adaptation? And so within the UN system, we bring in money largely from the Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund to Africa. To give an example, in UNEP, where I'm the director for Africa, we've brought in around $500 million of climate financing for Africa from the Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund. And that is replicated across the board within the UN bodies that work in Africa. So we do quite a substantial amount on work on climate action, but it is really aligned to the priorities of the member states as we get them. So for UNEP, climate action is one of the three priorities, or as we call it, the triple planetary crisis. And climate is one of them, the other being nature and pollution and waste. And for UNEP, it is very clear to us what the priorities are. As the host of the Africa Ministerial Conference on Environment, the African ministers at their convenings every year provide for us Africa's priorities. So when we last met with the African ministers of environment here in beautiful Addis Ababa, where Ethiopia is the president of the African Ministerial Conference on Environment, they made it very clear what they want us to support them on. I think one of the biggest areas on climate action in supporting resilience at member states and adaptation is to support the ecosystem restoration priorities of Africa. I'll give two examples. One, support for the Great Green Wall. So UNEP has raised $60 million from the Global Environment Facility to support the Great Green Wall efforts of Africa. And one of the beneficiaries is the government of Ethiopia, where through the Prime Minister's Green Legacy Initiative, we are supporting the government to do that. So that is one of UNEP's big priorities. But as I said, we also support the countries to access climate financing. Accessing the Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund is a very complex and detailed process. So we bring to the countries technical expertise and capacity building through the different ministries to access that financing. And that is a priority. We have a whole unit within UNEP that just focuses on accessing the GEF unit and climate, the Green Climate Fund, and that is all we do. Work with the member states through their national designated entities to get the much needed funding. As the UN, we are really facing increasingly a large challenge in responding to the extreme weather events in Africa. They are happening more frequently. They are happening with a high degree of severity. And to give you an example, in Kenya, where UNEP is headquartered, for 4 years in a row, there was an extreme drought. And as the UN, we worked with the Kenyan government to support the drought efforts of the country. And then this year, the rains came in the same region and there were devastating floods. So imagine two extreme weather events in the same area. So it is becoming increasingly difficult. The measures you need for drought and floods are different. Now, we see that in Southern Africa this year, one part of the region is struggling with extreme drought and the other with extreme floods. In Zambia, there are extreme droughts. In Malawi, I was in Malawi last year, the impacts of Cyclone Freddy in Malawi, in Mozambique, parts of Southern Africa. So the demand for supporting countries to resettle people, to help them regain their lives in where the results of these extreme weather events have sometimes been total destruction, total loss and damage. So it's becoming increasingly important, and that is why we are also working with member states to encourage full replenishment of the loss and damage fund, which was established at COP28. That money is sorely needed by African countries to respond to the ever-growing extreme weather events and the loss and damage that they are experiencing. The Africa Forum on Sustainable Development is an absolutely important forum. And for us in UNEP, really, the key messages would be structured around the work we do on the climate crisis as one of the triple planetary crises we address. How can we support member countries to address this in a world where we know that African member states, as the Deputy Secretary General has told us, and the Executive Secretary of the UN Commission for Africa, that member states are struggling with debt repayment. They are struggling with the ability to mobilize enough domestic resources to deal with the competing interests and challenges they have. Now, climate change is compounding that. If a country is paying a debt, we are told anywhere up to 40% of their national GDP in many countries, what is going to happen when a cyclone Freddy hits? What is going to happen when there's a drought? So this forum is very important to address the interconnectedness of the global crises. And so when we hear member states call on the need to reform the global financial architecture, we see why that is important, because without that holistic approach and the recognition of the interdependentness between the climate crisis and the debt crisis, and how the global community needs to come together to bring the two together to support African countries. I think this is, for me, one of the very important messages that I see coming out of this, going forward for the high-level political forum, but also for the COP that is coming up, that the climate financing and its link to the global financial architecture. Those conversations must be held together because they impact the same countries.